What's that? Okay. Yeah, there's some images running in the back as round up. Microphone? Yeah, this is okay. So I'm really going to just set up a framework here based on an encounter that between these two extraordinary figures, Louis Eastman and Arthur Russell, at a very specific moment in New York City, and we'll just kind of I have some ideas to propose, but I'm really not interested in proposing something. I just want to present this as a staging, and then we can discuss what implications this has, because it has many more than that's simply the particular encounter. So Eastman and Russell, I think, were artists whose career defies synopsis. Again, I'm going to do this horrible, violent thing and give you just very quickly, it's sort of a snippet of what their biography is. So Eastman was born in Manhattan in 1940, grew up in Ithaca. He a pianist and composer in contemporary music circles, starting at SUNY Buffalo, which was a super scene of really contemporary music, the mecca of the avant-garde in the mid-60s. He's a creative associate, part of Creative Associates, founding member of the SCM Ensemble in 1970. I think the ensemble might still be playing. He was a singer with a 5-octave range, an actor, dancer, performer, legendary for his 1971 performance as the vocal lead in Peter Maxwell Davis's 8 Songs for Mad King. I'm going to play a bit of it later, which was really one of the most important avant-garde oratorios of the day, for which he won a Grammy nomination. This was, of course, his greatest recognition as it were from the establishment. Also known as a jazz improviser on piano and organ. Hardly any of his testaments of his playing in the jazz setting sort of exist, but jazz elements can be seen in many of his compositions, which leave room for improvisation in the midst of scripted composition. I think he's considered one of the, sort of sometimes a precursor or founder of minimalism. I think it's totally reductive to call him a minimalist. What we have in mind are the classic examples: Lamont Young, Phil Glass, Steve Reich. I think his music is best described as ecstatic music, and I think that the repetition element, that is the microtonal repetition element that is taken to be the characteristic of minimalism, comes from, of course, the significance of repetition in black music. Just to give you an idea, his piece "Stay On It," which is probably one of the most performed pieces along with Feminine, was done in 1973. It is considered to be a classic minimalist piece in his biography. It has many elements from basically funk music and vocal music, black vocal music in repetition. There's the riff "Stay On It" and so on. It was composed, performed in 1973. This is before music in 12 parts and music for 18 musicians was done. I mean, in that respect, even before the so-called great figures of minimalism. Anyway, two essential elements are important in his trajectory: the Attica prison uprising and the Stonewall riots. These are essential events on how he reconceives his music and himself as a composer and performer. This is, I think, ultimately what leads him to New York City. Before this happened, literally before this happened, and some people say this is why it happened, but I think it's more complex than that. There's a famous event, June 4th, 1975 in Buffalo, notorious because he's performing John Cage's solo for Boys number 8, whose instructions read in part, Cage, right? In a situation provided with maximum amplification, no feedback, perform a disciplined action without any interruptions, fulfilling in whole or in part an obligation to others. That's the instruction. So in Cage's presence, Eastman proceeds to give a lesson on what he calls, and I quote, different systems of love, while stripping naked a young white man and a young black woman on stage in clear queering of the composer's instructions. Cage loses his Buddhist cool and storms outraged at the irreverent young interpreter. He slammed the piano and his comments the next day were, what you see in Julius Eastman from one performance to the next, he does the same thing, harps on the same things, in other words, does his thing, and that his thing unfortunately has become this one thing of sexuality. This is a direct quote, Cage quote. I don't approve because the ego of Julius Eastman is closed in on the subject of homosexuality. Of course, we know that Cage was gay. And we know this because he has no other idea to express. In a Zen situation where his mind might open up and flow with something beyond his imagination, he doesn't know the first step to take. This is an extraordinary thing from a composer who's notorious for being completely sort of non-expressive. Once the rage subsided, later Cage was quoted as saying, admittedly, Julius Eastman performs beautifully, and if it were not for the fact that the performance was connected with my work, I could easily find it enjoyable. Or as my father used to tell me, don't give it a thought, 10 years later you won't remember it. Again, quote from, I mean, the whole issue here, this has been discussed extensively, you know, Eastman is outing Cage, I mean, of course, he's also doing the kind of performance, incendiary performance that he, of course, was known for. Julius Eastman's response might be summarized in a later statement he made in relation to his work in general, but particularly the event. I was a kind of a talented freak who occasionally injected some vitality into programming. This, within 2 months, by the way, George Lewis has described this beautifully as deformation of mastery, and I think that this is really the gesture that we have to think throughout Eastman's work. Probably, I think also Russell, I'll get to that in a second. So Eastman moves to New York City in 1976, becomes part of both of the avant-garde and the gay downtown disco scene. He's as a keyboardist and vocalist for Russell's Dinosaur L collective group, he improvises and performs as singer, actor, dancer, conducts and teaches in the black neighborhoods of Brooklyn. He takes over the Brooklyn Philharmonia from 1977 to 1980. This is really a neighborhood philharmonic, and its purpose was to work with really in the neighborhoods. Although it also, you know, performed in the avant-garde spaces like the Kitchen. In 1980, there is the famous event, Northwestern University, that I will say nothing about now because that's a big part of what I'm doing later, and you'll hear Eastman directly. So I'm going to skip this part. Eastman's attempts to get hired at Cornell as professor of music fail. We cannot possibly discount race or sexuality being factors. Facing financial problems, but also due to his enormous intransigence and even a penchant for the aesthetic and the abject. He lives on the edge under his brother's good graces, spends much time in the streets, known to be giving pedicures to men at homeless shelters, while composing the piece, "If You're Smart, Why Aren't You Rich?" Eventually he gets evicted and all his scores and manuscripts are thrown out in the street in trash bags by the NYPD. He ignores all this and begins to live as a homeless man in Tompkins Square Park, succumbing to mental illness and addiction. In 1990, May 29, he checks in all alone at Buffalo Hospital in utter deterioration and dies of cardiac arrest shortly thereafter, entirely alone. His friends suspect AIDS complications, but there's no official medical account to determine that. The musical world does not realize he's gone. It takes 9 months for the first obituary to appear in the Village Voice. Most of Eastman's music has been lost. A great deal has been reconstructed from scraps and some scanned recordings, although we have precious little from his improvisations, his theatrical performances, or his disco experiments, except whatever is saved in the Russell Archive. Given the room for interpretation in his pieces, it's unclear whether these new recordings by extremely accomplished contemporary classical music ensembles, for which we are also grateful. And by the way, there's an incredible event going on at the Red Cat, which which is really exactly this thing, the intersection between Julius Eastman and Arthur Russell, which all of you Angelinos must see. It's happening throughout February to April. So we're grateful for these things, but we cannot possibly say that that's how you conceive this composition, but this ought not to matter. The last quote is, what I'm trying to achieve is to be what I am to the full, in the fullest, black to the fullest, a musician to the fullest, a homosexual to the fullest. Arthur Russell was born in 1952 in Oskaloosa, Iowa. He moved, I'm going to go very quickly, he moved in 1968 to San Francisco to join a Buddhist commune where he was forbidden to play his cello, so he played in the closet. He then studied North Indian music and vocal, basically Punjabi music at the San Francisco Conservatory of Music. This is very, very important, actually, his work. His association with Allen Ginsberg begins then. He accompanies Ginsberg's poetry performance with his cello and teaches him basic Indian musical scales. In 1973, he moves to New York, attends Manhattan School of Music for only a year before clashing with his music composition teachers. He moves into an apartment on East 12th Street, his sole residence until he dies, mostly in impoverished conditions. Famously, electricity was supplied by Ginsberg via an extension cord through the window from the floors above. Swiftly becoming part of the downtown avant-garde scene, he takes over at the age of 23 as musical director of The Kitchen, 1974-75, whose proclivities for serious minimalism of the flute glass kind he transgresses, we can also say, with pop sensibilities, adding to the mixed bands like the Modern Lovers or Talking Heads. Arthur Russell can be heard playing cello in the very first version of Psycho Killer when the band is still a trio. 1976 to 82, major involvement in New York's disco scene, especially in legendary queer clubs like the Loft, the Gallery, Paradise Garage, under different names, Dinosaur L, Loose Joints, Indian Ocean. Big New York club hits such as Kiss Me Again with David Byrne on guitar, Pop Your Funk with plucked cello and brushed gong for rhythm, Is It All Over My Face, with Julius Eastman singing baritone on Go Bang and in the Corn Belt. We'll hear one of these later. Here I would like to include a 13-minute masterpiece with Indian percussion, trombone, cello, and Eastman's baritone called The Light of the Miracle. You have to imagine these pieces were actually performed in disco clubs with a band, which is, they weren't just spinning records, but they would come into the dance spaces with their instruments and play while people would dance. One of these legendary performances captured live at the Kitchen. This will be, in fact, it's called 2424. It's going to be performed at the Red Cat for the first time ever since that single performance back then. Russell writes music for Robert Wilson's Medea, but Wilson opts not to use them after notorious incidents that I can go into in the discussion if you want. Fragments of the work are performed by a small orchestra with Eastman conducting as Tower of Meaning. That actually album exists. He's also part of the group The Necessaries. There's a lot of pop music that's extraordinary that he's done. And only a single record under his name called World of Echo, which is a solo cello and voice record with extraordinary echo work, both on the voice and the cello. The cello is amplified. It's a kind of and with amazing poetry. I mean, I don't know how many lyricists. The kind of writing he does as a poet is quite amazing. He will die of AIDS 6 years later in near total impoverishment while continuing to perform solo with cello until his illness makes it impossible. He leaves behind, this is very interesting, unlike Eastman, whose all his manuscripts are almost gone, almost all his manuscripts are gone, Russell is the exact opposite. He leaves behind over 1,000 recorded tapes, full studio quality reels or cassette demos, oftentimes with multiple versions of the same piece, covering the full range of his interests from Indian-inspired drones to bubblegum pop, to trance rhythms, abstract cello, bass songs, etc. Russell's unfinished music is itself a sort of genre in this trajectory, and his rediscovery, the posthumous releases, of course, keep happening, quite extraordinary. Now, I want to say one thing about the death. I think that this has to be said, regardless of the fact that AIDS in Eastman's case was never medically established. I think that both deaths have to be accounted for as part of this great epidemic, massacre really, as casualties, especially in the creative arts world of a whole way of life. Not just a series of individual deaths, but mass deaths of a life. This is not merely, say, sociological. It is very much part of the entire aesthetic mapping, aesthetic in the strict sense, as the path of somatic and psychic communal being. Okay, I'm interested in this encounter in a very, very specific way, and I can say a lot. There's a lot more to be said about them, but this encounter happens because of two components or two communities that bring these people together. Because their sensibility, all their differences, finds kindred spirits and bodies. The first one is the downtown avant-garde that becomes a home for the desire to exceed their musical training in collaborative ways. And the second, of course, is the queer scene after Stonewall, which crosses this space with its own musicality and artistic expression. The downtown gay disco scene is not Studio 54, it's really much more experimental, both musically and, of course, in other ways. Music and community become enmeshed in both cases and clearly in intersecting ways, with collaboration, improvisation, and experimentation being the intrinsic modus vivendi. I would hesitate to call this music queer music when it's that sort of naive essentialist thing. And yet, no doubt, at least part of it emerges from and intervenes in the vicissitudes of queer life. And even when it does not in a visible sense, say in the space of so-called serious music, I mean, not the disco stuff, we cannot just take Eastman's gesture of gay guerrilla as a trivial act. A great guide, I cannot elaborate on this, but if those of you who know this piece, you will understand. A great guide to what I'm trying to say here would be an early but classic article by Lauren Berlant and Michael Warner called Sex in Public, memorable among other things for being the first text to introduce the notion of heteronormativity, and also an extraordinary description at the end of a publicly staged scene of erotic vomiting. This piece, where they develop this notion of queer counterpublics and the whole way that they think about what they have to say, sex in public, is the key to my connection of these two figures in this context. And I do think that if we think of, we've come to think of Black life as integral, even if infinitely differentiated signifier, I think that in the same way we can think about queer life. Both Eastman and Russell celebrate for what is called genre-fluid music. I'm not buying these terms, I'm just reporting. They also coincide in terms of an intrinsic intransigence in the face of failure during their lifetime, an abject, impoverished, in a sense tragic way of life, and condemnation to obscurity, and a glorious revival and recognition in the last 10, 15 years, which itself presents a whole other set of problems. I do think that we need to discuss certainly these resources. They're like the super figures, right now, rightfully so. But what does this mean in relation to the fact that in their lifetime they were recognized among their peers, but they were not. They're now part of history that they helped make, except that this history cannot be composed on the basis of a simple biography or a life story. So here I'm going to go to some sound. This is Eastman's famous statement before his concert in Northwestern, because of the controversial way that he titled and presented his piece. So let's hear. Oh, wait, we have to have it louder here. There's not loud. Mine is as loud as you can.
Is your thing on your computer switched to the headphone output?
Now we have feedback. Okay, sorry.
That the titles were somehow derogatory in some manner, being that the word nigger is in it. These particular titles, the reason I use them is because, in fact, there's a whole series of these pieces, and they're called, they can be called a nigger series. Now, the reason I use that particular word is because, for me, it has what I call a basicness about it. That is to say, I feel that in any case, the first niggers were, of course, field niggers. And upon that is really the basis of the American economic system. Without field niggers, you wouldn't really have such a great and grand economy that we have. So that is what I call the first and great nigger, field niggers. And what I mean by niggers is that thing which is fundamental, that person or thing that attains to a basicness, a fundamentalness, and eschews that thing which is superficial or what can we say, elegant. So that, a nigger for me is that kind of thing which attains himself or herself to the ground of anything. You see, and that's what I mean by nigger. So there are many niggers. There are many kinds of niggers. There are of course 99 names of Allah, and there are 52 niggers. And so therefore, we are playing two of these niggers. Now the reason I use gay gorilla, Guerrilla, that one, is because these names, let me put a little subsystem here. These names, either I glorify them or they glorify me. And in the case of gorilla, that glorifies gay. That's to say, there aren't many gay gorillas. I don't feel that gaydom does have that strength. So therefore, I use that word in the hopes that they will. You see, at this point, I don't feel that gay gorillas can really match with Afghani gorillas or PLO gorillas. But let us hope in the future that they might. You see, that's why I use that word gorilla. It means a gorilla is someone who is, in any case, sacrificing his life for a point of view. And you know, if there is a cause, and if it is a great cause, those who belong to that cause will sacrifice their blood, because without blood there is no cause. So therefore, that is the reason that I use gay gorilla, in hopes that I might be one, if called upon to be one.
Okay, so there are two things I want to underline here, again, incredibly briefly, as this is a framework. The first is the notion of the fundamental, or the elemental, the raw material. I think is basically saying what said now. This particular word bears a basicness and irreducibility, a profound, if abyssal, integrity. Abyssal though it is, it nonetheless entails ground, or if you will, if its irreducibility, its non-mutability, its plenitude might be abyssal and thus groundless, much as what it denotes, how its use, its racist violence, etc., pertains to an abysmal existence, an objection that cannot be translated to something else. It is nonetheless, in its absolute integrity / irreducibility, a sort of fundament, a base from which one can interpret, compose, perform a whole array of gestures, practices, ways of life that will always, by virtue of the objection they derive from, constitute a subversion, an aversion to things pretty, palliative, rounded, completed, elegant, he says. And indeed, a revolutionary violence, an incendiary violence, the Cage incident, and of course the Northwestern event itself. The second is the notion of sacrificing oneself or being called upon to act with such violence. And the shift here from the language of race to the language of sexuality needs to be noted. The term guerrilla is attached to gay because that is what has not yet come to be realized. Well, presumably, it has been in the radical black tradition, the Panther tradition, say, or the Pan-African anti-colonial tradition, negritude, and so on. Although we must pause and underline the two named references of living actual guerrilla movements at the time, Afghan guerrillas and Palestinians. Think of how this resides today. We're talking about 1981. And how the revolutionary violence of gay politics is on a similar path towards realization, actualization, and that the music is a sort of preparation to shed this blood, a sort of preparation, a rehearsal for the moment of being called upon to act. That is the reason I use gay guerrilla in the hope that I might be one if called upon to be one. It's a stunning statement. So I see this movement from the fundamental, the ground that exists, the most basic thing that gives meaning to everything, to the future that is to be, the radical undoing of this era. The second thing that I want to address, in super speed, the voice. I think the key intersection between these two figures, they're composers and performers, incredible musicians, as players. But what really, I think, is all that is there is the voice, the voice, the singing and the words themselves. Keep in mind that Eastman improvised vocal pieces with words that he completely made up, and we'll hear one of them shortly. So Russell clearly sought Eastman's baritone, or at least he had the daring imagination to think how this sliding range from the deep baritone to the scream falsetto would work in overtly sexualized but totally unorthodox and unexpected dance music. It's a fact that he first sought Julius in order to find a conductor to handle his orchestral pieces, particularly what are called instrumentals, which have almost impossible to perform instructions, even if the music itself is rather simple by contemporary classical standards. And his ill-fated score, of course, as we said, for Wilson's Medea, which Eastman was the conductor. Having said that, Russell sought Eastman's voice, as well as his extraordinary piano skills, which Eastman put to use in memorable instances of improvising on the electric organ as part of the disco band. So let me play here two things, two vocal things. Sorry. So this is from the Mad King stuff you'll hear. This one is from the Prelude to the Holy Presence of Joan of Arc. This was
Saint Michael said, Saint Margaret said, Saint Catherine said, they said, Saint Michael said, Saint Catherine said, Saint Margaret said, she said, Saint Margaret said, Saint Catherine said.
This goes on for 12 minutes, and he repeats the saints' names and the vocal range. I wish I had time to play more. The last thing I would play really time is from Go Bang, which is, so we're gonna move into disco here. which is the band playing. Russell's playing piano, and cello is playing electric piano, and Eastman's playing organ and singing. Oh, sorry. That's the other. That was, we were from the other. I'm now coming to the end. Organic music, ecstatic music, and so on. Eastman named his music organic music and refused the term minimalism. So did Russell. Even though, as I said, they've been interpolated in this category. I remind you, Russell was kind of a Phil Glass protege for a while. In fact, a piece that we have not heard, I don't know if it exists, Glass composed a solo cello piece for a Mabu Mines production of Beckett's Cascando, which apparently Russell changed so much that it was unrecognizable. And Glass, in a kind of semi, not too flattering way, accepted. And anyway, lots has been written about Russell's Buddhist methods and practices. That's actually established. Allen Ginsberg had notoriously quipped early on that Arthur was an enormously learned and talented composer who wanted to create Buddhist bubblegum music. That was Ginsberg's thing. One of Eastman's last written pieces from the period of his demise is called Buddha, and it is a circular score. I think that it may have come on the pictures without any instructions as to what instrument or instruments would play. His Christian language is drawn from the mystics, obviously Jeanne d'Arc, the Jeanne d'Arc pieces, but generally the devotional tradition that reminds us of how the sacred means also a state of subjection, abjection even, a kind of horrific and horror-inducing profanity, literally speaking. It's inaccurate to say that Eastman turned to mysticism only late in his life as he was deteriorating. His 1976 improvisational performance at the Environ Loft in New York was titled "Praise God from whom all devils grow." No recording of this exists, alas, but the review of the show described, first of all, Eastman himself said that he was unleashing black forces. We know that. The reviewer said it's intense, astringent, demonic. Even if it might be considered overstretching, Eastman's mystical/demonic expressions are in fact linked to that statement at Northwestern, which I played earlier. What is black and gay guerrilla is precisely this demonic power. Eastman explicitly called his music organic, referring to its structurally cumulative nature, where notes eventually sounding together in a long extending multiplicity create a microtonal saturation, so that the ear ceases to seek to distinguish the notes, but because it has no choice but to plunge into the abyssal polyphony of the sound. In the end, both composers are seeking ecstatic states, but in a sense closer to kind of a dervish discipline, that is to say, involving the body more than the mind-psychic contemplative devotion. In this specific way, the fact that they are thought to belong to minimalism in downtown 70s New York City is only partially apropos and ultimately inadequate. This is organic, ecstatic music that emerges and returns to the fragility of real life and death, which in their case emerged from and was testament to this commitment to live. Thank you.
Just a couple of questions on my own and observations. So I was struck, I mean, I guess maybe I would start by asking you both to perhaps think aloud about how you might consider temporality to be an important component of your projects. For example, I was struck, Stathis, in your presentation, in listening, right, to the recitation of the saints, the way that seems to also reference a sort of Paul Robeson-esque kind of performance. But also, you know, you said that music is a preparation to shed itself, to act. You talked about, like, the future that is to be. And it made me think about disco also as a kind of disco as a way that, I mean, people have written about disco and ecstasy and as kind of elongation of time that also attends the club scene and things like that. But I was struck too that part of the lyrics in what you played was about going back to the disco, right? Like, so there is this kind of way that I think the sort of, at least in that account, or in that song, the aesthetic is also connected to a different kind of temporality, about a kind of return to that space. Sorry. Okay, and then Natalie, sorry, I took so many notes. It was very, I mean, I love this panel. It's really sparked a lot of thoughts for me. But I was thinking, with your presentation, there's something about the way that you're talking about blackness as cipher, right, the key. And it made me keep thinking, which you get to a little bit, but I think you could maybe, I'd love to hear you say a little bit more about it, but that is the role that you would say repetition might be playing here. In particular, in relationship to what you talk about later, which came out in both of your presentations, right? The kind of idea of the raw material. Because for me, then the raw material puts us in the realm of economics, right? It puts us in the realm of sort of value, and a touchstone essay for myself is James Sneed's on repetition in Black culture, where one of the things that he's interested in doing is thinking about how repetition in Black culture can be thought in relationship to what he's talks about as a kind of like insurance, like the way that kind of insurance would work, right, as to hedge against something that would be in the future, whereas in repetition, right, there's not that need to hedge against the future because there's also improvisation, there's something that's kind of looping back through, right? So that's kind of just my initial thoughts, and also possibly provocations for you.
Thank you. I would say that repetition relates to temporality. There's something cyclical about especially the two songs that cyclical thematically, not just in terms of the repetition of the clave, but this return, right, to the hillside, the space of the maroon, Monte Adentro, as Luigi Teixeira sings in La Clave, and also this return to this scene of fugitivity, perhaps because that moment of freedom is still in the horizon. It's not there yet. I mean, to me, in both of the songs that I played, I would say it's not necessarily a hedging against the future, but a return, I would say, to an unfinished past, right? This I hate this word or this term because it's so played out, very 90s. But the afterlife, right? The afterlife of slavery that continues to repeat, and this need to go back to it, to this fundamental, elemental site that needs to be, I would even say liberated, because I think especially the Shidor songs, as I said at the end of my talk, is against, or is sort of militating against this notion of freedom as sovereignty, as political sovereignty, but a freedom that leads to the unbecoming of the subject within this logic of modernity.
And unbecoming.
And
too,
unbecoming,
is kind of-
yeah.
Yeah, I think I'm very close to Natalie's response. First of all, your question remains, it needs to be answered, but the song, it's not I want to go back, I want to go bang.
Oh, bang, okay.
And it is obviously, you're right, I mean, I want to be with all my friends at once, I want to go bang.
Okay.
And it is in that atmosphere, I don't need to elaborate. And that is really the kind of surging as they're playing, and he does that, and then later on he screams it out. It's anyway, the issue here of but in the obviously in the presentation of the two very controversial things, the end series and the gay gorilla, there is a past and future that is set up, because in the first is elemental historically, but it's present. It's not. It's present. The other is also present, but in his mind, and it's very interesting at the time, because it's still post Stonewall, but before AIDS activism. The sense is that the militancy that the Black radical tradition has already fielded has not yet happened, and there is an aspirational element. But notice, it's not just aspirational. It's I have to be ready now. I have to prepare myself now to be called upon, when called upon, to be there to act. So there's a kind of merging. Time is really not at all past, present, future. Or if you're going to use these terms, the terms are merged. Not in some kind of, let's say, constant present, the same sort of modernist present, but in that kind of repetition present, which it enables us to have time, all access to all times, both cyclical, both memory-based, but also fantasy-based, which is really how I consider that, which has not yet been created. So I think that's how we have to think of it, and the let's say the classical pieces, in both of them, quotation marks, they're kind of interminable. I mean, the score can be just a page, but you can play for 2 hours, and you're not repeating really exactly what the score says. It's in some ways, as I said, it's a kind of cumulative saturation for Eastman. For Russell, it's also similar. I mean, because the musicians have to hear, some of these instructions is, you have to hear what the other person is doing and remember to repeat it on the 5th measure. or the ninth one, but you're deciding when you're going to do it. The other person's, no, it's not what you're doing. So this kind of thing, what is the temporality of this kind of thing? It's very hard to say really, except for the fact that this is kind of, it's not a past, present, future one.
Which is why it's ecstatic in some cases.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, and it's ecstatic, as I said, not in the kind of contemplation of mystical contemplation of God, but it's in the body. And that's why I thought that there is strength is a good one by now.
I see, Erin?
Thank you both so much for these really incredible thought-provoking interventions. I'm kind of amazed by the connections.
Yes,
that,
we
you know,
are too.
This was not planned, by the way,
Yeah.
on the part of the organizers, but also the connection between some of the other talks. So, I mean, the kind of the fundamental element between the two of you. I thought the Northwestern scene is kind of an interesting counterexample to what Blondie was talking about yesterday with Tia Lewis. Almost like does work. I don't like opposites, but kind of moves in an opposing direction, maybe. Than like what happened, kind of the violence of that kind of interrogation. And then also, I think, Stathis, your talk brought me back. Again, that scene of sort of being ready to respond to a call, which is a certain kind of listening, right? Preparing myself to listen
Very good,
to a call. That brought me back, Fumi, to your talk yesterday and to our conversation afterwards, where you said, well, I call it politics for kind of lack of a better term, but that's not really what I mean. So I'm kind of curious about what these experimental practices, what kind of politics, in quotation marks, it prepares one for. Because it seems like it's not like he has this concrete idea of what the guerrilla would do, or what the program would be, or what the plan is, or even what the ideological position is. So it's a kind of illegible politics, and yet there's a need for action. But there's a history of sort of different iterations of this problem, right? Where experimentation is irresponsible, it's unethical, it's certainly not political or not politicizable, right? I'm even thinking of the prologue to Invisible Man, where, in that incredible scene of listening, where when he's finally able to listen to what I piece of Black and Blue, and he's able to hear around corners, he says it inhibits action. So in fact, that's precisely the moment where he cannot act, and yet there's this crucial and powerful insight that's been talked about by, of course, Fred Moten, Alex Illier, and Michael Sawyer. So I guess I'm wondering about this relationship between experimentation, avant-garde, aesthetics, and the thing we call politics, but maybe is in search of another name.
I mean, yeah, I think that in the case, both of these figures clearly felt that the experimental avant-garde, as it's known, left something to be desired. And I chose my terms on purpose. And because desire is really at play here. And that in fact, but nonetheless, the skills that it gives you, and a certain kind of relationship to music that it gives you, are not to be thrown out of the window. They're just not adequate in themselves. So what you do is, it's not rejection of that, you just simply take that, and you leave the uptown, sort of stodgy uptown scene, and you also leave the soon becoming kind of stodgy downtown scene, because it itself becomes a kind of a cliff. And what do? Well, you go to those spaces that are not, where people are not, technically, proficient per se. But I mean, it was very interesting. The discussion earlier we had about audiences. This would be, that's how I think of it. I mean, these audiences are also participants. You don't really create these things for them simply to respond to. Especially when you imagine taking these bands in these places and playing and dancing. So I think that the experimentation then suddenly becomes collective. It's not just an artist being, breaking ground in his mind, her mind, whatever. But it's the experimentation happens literally on the floor, and it has no end in that way. And the politics then, I think, emerged in the most sort of radical democratic way of politics we can think of, which is for me, the fundamental element of radical democratic politics. People coming together in space. That's what it is. People who don't know each other, have no connection to each other, come together in a specific space where they then act together. I mean, think of the assembly movement and so on. So this is how I don't think of it. Now, for Eastman, racial politics, so let's say specifically, was very clear. I mean, he was absolutely clear about the fact that he was making political interventions. His queer politics, possibly equally clear. That's an interesting thing that I want to explore more, that I don't know. For Eastman, that's not entirely clear, because his Buddhism kind of gets in the way. But I think that, and people reject the politicization of Russell. They just say, "Oh, don't do that." But I cannot say that a person who commits so much of his energy and his skills to producing music that is collectively experienced in a community that, in fact, has a political being by virtue of its relationship to normativity, that we can say it's not political.
But political maybe not organized around or not conditional upon the constitution of the subject, whether it's a collective subject, much less an identity. And
it's not an identity, yes.
Ecstatic, like the example of ecstasy, or the emptying of the subject would be a different way in then, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's just interesting because you're talking about guerrilla, right? And I'm in my talk, the two words were rebellion and fugitivity.
Right.
And we know that there is a tradition in the Black radical tradition writing about fugitivity. So I'm thinking about what is the relationship, right, between rebellion, fugitivity, and guerrilla warfare, guerrilla tactics. It's just amazing how our papers came together, and we're thinking about ways of being or unbecoming that are not within the scope of maybe democratic politics as they exist now. And especially relevant considering what's happening right now, right? So how these songs, old songs, and the songs that I was looking at are not experimental at all, but they're sort of proposing a rebellion, a thematic, a political rebellion that sort of eschews the state, right, and the subject, the political subject, the modern subject. So I don't know.
I
What's
want to
the
say
relation
something
between
on that.
rebellion and guerrilla?
Yes, absolutely. It's a great thing that you brought it up. So, there's a critique, Moden has to deal with this critique that the politics of fugitivity, that's not an affirmative politics, it's negational. And people say that. I don't think it's the critique, I think it's just misguided. Because, guerrilla tactics, it literally, terms of warfare, is really warfare, fugitive warfare, that's what it is. You in essence run away from the field of battle and you move in and out of it you don't follow the rules of battle. If we're gonna put it that way, you hide, and you're always escaping. You can never really fully win by annihilating the enemy. You're creating trouble, basically. Okay, so there is a certain element of fugitivity and guerrilla even in that level. But I would like to argue that these politics, we have to, when we hear the word democratic, we have to forget the typical institutions, voting, representation. I'd like to, I'm an anarchist politically speaking, and for me, democracy, that's what it means. But I don't want that to be just simply a negation of politics. There's an affirmative element to it. So when these communities come together to be, and in all the contours of what being is together, in conditions that are both fun, ecstatic, etc., but also defiant and problematic in relation to a world that ghettoizes, marginalizes, and so on, and right, of course, very soon into what will be the epidemic. I see this really as a gesture both of negation against the establishment and affirmation. That's why I said the queer counterpublics, the Berlant Warner material here is very, very important too. It's an old piece that actually we should really revisit. And that's how I think of it. And that to me is democratic politics, because it's about equality, substitutability, where interchangeability, right? Those kinds of elements.
I'm thinking about the resurgence in the last 10 or so years of Eastman's music, and to some extent also Russell, although that started a little bit earlier. And what I hear you finding in their connection is a point of something like anarchy within experimental music, because you don't know which direction it's headed. It's headed several directions at the same time. And this, the social context then disappears with the AIDS epidemic. And I don't know how you feel or how other people feel, but the resurgence feels like a domestication of
Yes,
it. Like a grasping of this into, this has now become another accepted avant-garde, and we can like it now.
No, I agree completely. I agree completely with that. That's why I kind of insinuated, but I wanted exactly someone from the audience to bring it up. I feel that way, although I think that I'm infinitely appreciative of the fact that we are now. I mean, especially in the Eastman case, because the scores are lost. I mean, some were. I mean, they're reconstructed. So we are really getting our hands on his music. And it's true of Russell's too. His tapes are it's extraordinary music that he considered. He wasn't happy with the release. So it's absolutely true though. There's canonization. That's what's going on there. And the world that they sociologically, it's not just the AIDS epidemic. It's the gentrification of New York that kills that space. I mean, that's so. So anything that is now discovered from that space inevitably cannot find that space, and an element of normalization, canonization enters in. So we have to definitely be aware of that. This does not say though that we should not appreciate the performances. I mean, Wild Dog is an extraordinary group. I mean, the Eastman performances. It's just extraordinary what they're doing. We can't minimize their effort at doing this and all the other sort of tributes that people are making. But yes, there's no doubt about it.
And I mean, just briefly, I would say it's a question for you, Natalie, just, to think about, because I hear your project is also wanting to reclaim the Blackness within, to make it more visible, more perceptible, that type of thing. And it made me wonder, what would be the sort of outcome of that? And I think that there's a way that this connects to what you were asking, which is there's something that could be insurgent in a certain moment around gay male culture in New York, and we can talk about queerness. I can talk about that for a long time, but I won't right now. But and then when the sort of social context for that being insurgent is taken away, then what do we have? And I wonder too, you're doing really excellent work to kind of just to help us to understand the way that a certain kind of anti-Blackness works through this music. But then I wonder, if we did all just acknowledge and see it, then what kind of work would it then be doing? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not trying to do the work. Thank you. And I think the quick answer to your question is I'm still thinking about what that looks like. But what in terms of this reclaiming, or as I say, desedimenting, right, this fundamental Blackness, my goal isn't necessarily to advance some type of identity, black identity politics within Latin America, but this sedimented blackness, right? This effacement of blackness within Latin America has very real material effects in terms of policy, economics, lived conditions, and so and that's far outside my purview. But I think as a collective project for those of us who are working on this in various fields, and I think this is where Winter's notion of decipherment is particularly important for me, because she's thinking about how humanists, scientists, right, people across disciplines can work together, right, in this this project of decipherment that has real material effects on the conditions of Black people in terms of her thinking aesthetics, right? She's thinking about the United States, but also the Caribbean and Latin America. So I would say my part in this, right, is to sort of bring this desedimentation to the fore, and then collaborate with people across other disciplines, right, to think about, well, what does this look like materially? Besides saying Black people are effaced, or Black people exist in Latin America, and they're not talked about, which is just, you know, repeating sort of identity representation, which I'm not interested in doing at all.
Did you say that was your?
You hit, your response hit on the
Okay.
impression, so you just did it
Yeah.
for me, thank you.
I'm sorry.
No, that's great.
Were there other questions, comments? Yes.
Sure. So when you're talking about the movement or the happening, things happen in an organic way, again, they have their power in that, right? Which you can't recreate from nostalgia. You know, it's like when you do it later, it's great, but it's not that organic thing. It kind of reminds me of the punk movement, right? The punk movement started, listening, it was not like the punk movement. You have to go this way. It was people coming together that felt disenfranchised, who found a place to be together. Right? And the other thing I was thinking is that, despite what you said, and I think you're going to agree, is that you take this music, you take this time period, you take the power of that, the symbol, it resurges, right? I understand that that's not the same. But apart from that, we still have to say the music is not the same because it's now, but the music has the power that stands alone.
Yeah, that's true. I agree with that. Yeah, I agree. That's why I said I appreciate the fact that these great groups are playing this very difficult music, they're interpreting, and they're actively engaged, because the interpretations of the scores are really so open, and so therefore there's a lot of creative work, inventive, so I mean creative that way, that goes in. The music, I'm the kind of person that would separate, art from context if I want to. I do that just as well, but at the same time, let's say when I'm teaching, I always have to make sure that everybody understands the context of whatever it is that we're reading or doing. So you gotta do things, we're gonna do both things. So, and I would give anything to have been, in the Paradise Garage when we were playing this thing. I would really wish I had a time machine to be there, to be dancing, and to be part of that, or the kitchen performance. But and I can only imagine. But nonetheless, it's not the same. But nor is the music the same. But it is possible to say that there's something about the music or the art, whatever art work, that reiterates itself and always changes the context in which it reiterates itself, and may in fact create a new story. And we have to resist canonization, of course, but in our ears even, as we listen to them in our comfortable home, that sort of thing. But I'm glad that all these music.
But context-wise, as you say, in a way, what would be more relevant, if you take the context, each president, would be what is inspired from that when you create something new.
Yeah.
That would be, I think,
Yeah, no, I agree.
contextually relevant.
are listening to these salsa recordings, and you're seeking out the clave, and you find your ear bending toward whatever is playing the music, right? I'm just wondering if you notice in your body, because I know you have a lot of experience as a dancer as well, that you listen to the 2-3 clave any differently than the 2-2 clave.
Oh,
The forward versus the backward. Does your ear bend one way or the other? That's where I was.
I need to think more about that because I actually respond to the cowbell.
Oh,
I actually have, when that cowbell hits, I actually start to have a very ecstatic experience. No, I'm serious. I'm not even, like, I remember I was dancing sometime last semester, and this guy was saying, "Nota que tú realmente sientes la música." It's like, it's obvious that you really feel the music. I mean, that could be very essentialist, but there's something about, so for those of you who are familiar with what I'm talking about, so oftentimes the cowbell is used also as the simultaneous to the clave to also keep time, and that has you could hear it in the Rebellion song that I played. So I actually respond to that. It's funny though, because I mentioned that there's this whole debate that I wasn't familiar with, that I learned about a decade ago, about where people are breaking on this stuff. And because I never learned in a class, I've had to educate myself in order to give these types of talks. So it's sort of like this reverse education. And so I don't actually know how I break. I mean, I actually had to take classes when I moved here because the salsa scene here is on steroids. And if you don't spin or dip or do all this other ballroom stuff, people won't dance with you. So I took classes. But I've had to like educate myself just to actually talk about it because I came into salsa organically and through listening to it at home and dancing and like being taught by one of our friends in college. So but that's something that I need to think about, like which one. I actually think I resonate with Colombian salsa and old school salsa roja or salsa brava, and I think that's the 2-3, I think. So I need to think about that. Good question.
We have time for another question or comment? Yeah.
I wanted to return to the Berlin and Warner evocation that you offered there, and that end scene of that essay. I always remember when I teach it because my students are like, "Wait, why is this sex?" Which is a great question, and I think like part of the point of the creation of the counterpublic, which is like the expansion of what erotics means and like what desire means. So my question was, in thinking about gay guerrilla as like a politics of survival and one that attends to desire, I was curious how desire figures as a politics of listening in Eastman's archive, and whether he writes about desire or speaks about desire, and how that becomes part of this kind of politics of survival if we want to see gay guerrilla action in this moment of surviving in the AIDS pandemic.
Yeah, I don't, we have very little. He's written only one article. He published The Composer's Weekly. That's the title. And we have a radio interview, which is actually very important, and which is a little later, and then the statement. So there isn't much. I don't think it's, let's say, reflections. I think that his stance at the end, "Oh, I no longer write music. I just sing the names of the saints." This stuff is really, it's very rich for interpretation. I mean, we have accounts from his very close friends and his lovers about his personal practices, which suggest a very uncompromising, incredibly intensity, real uncompromising position in terms of the erotics, of everything. But I don't think that apart from the statement, which is really short and kind of remarkable, this thing about calling and I'm ready to be ready and for it, we don't have direct reflections from him. But it seems to me that part of his deterioration. This is really, I'm on a limb on this one. Okay. Just a few statements we have, or testimonies of him appearing at his doorstep with his friends in really terrible condition and so on. And his comments of completely giving up, a sense of futility about everything. The end of desire, basically, is really what brings about his end. This would be my interpretation, which is really kind of it's almost upsetting at parts of this whole story.
If I can add to that, just to speak to your question a little bit, you're totally right. We don't have a lot, but in the last couple of years of Eastman's life, instead of characterizing it as a giving up, I would characterize it as a transcendence. Eastman goes more and more spiritual, and in the last piece that he performs at BAM in 1986, which has both a vocal register and then a dual piano piece that he performs with Joyce Solomon, he is very much thinking about we are no longer at this base level, this fundamental level, but we are in a spiritual register where he's much less interested in being human and much more interested in moving beyond. So I see it as more of a transcendence than a letting go.
No, I think that's fair. I won't dispute that, actually. I'm just saying the statements in relation to music and the kind of things that, his life, even the friendships break. Although one can extrapolate from also what you have expressed, that same position. I'm no longer part of this world, then really nothing really matters. Friendships don't matter, nothing matters, bodies don't matter, and then the whole thing just disintegrates. Yeah, I think that's fair. I wouldn't dispute that. Yeah. But there are statements of him saying, I'm done. And a certain kind of bitterness. There is bitterness also, by accounts of his friends. So the kind of desire to go, to let go of everything, to go beyond, which is no doubt about that he felt and he practiced, does not mean that he doesn't have bitterness, even rage.
Well,
we should not,
yeah.
These are part of the conditions that he's discussing.
Totally.
And part of the basicness that he's discussing.
Yeah, and I think even, in 1971, he's quoted in newspapers as saying, why is it so hard to become famous? Why is it so hard to be respected for my work?
We gotta know the reasons.
Yeah.
On that note,
I think I have